On this day, October 18th, 1860, the Peking Convention was held, which ratified the Treaty of Tienjin. This ended the Second Opium War. The Opium Wars are quite famous because of the opium. In many ways, these wars were more than just opium. You could say that they were more trade wars, in the way that there are many trade disputes between the United States and China now. It's similar in that China is trying right now to prevent foreign investment into China under a situation that you could invest in the United States or other countries. At the moment, no company can own more than 50% of any venture. Every company must hand over their intellectual property of how they build things and what it is they are doing. Many times, what the Chinese do is they give this intelligence or this information to a Chinese company, which then builds what this other company is doing cheaper, and after a few years, the foreign company is thrown out of the country and the Chinese company takes over, first within China, and then they start exporting. Huawei is a very good example of that. There are also very strict measures on people coming into the country. Visas are very hard to get, and there are certain areas where foreigners really aren't allowed, places like Tibet, Xinjiang. You have to get special permission and special visas internally to travel into these places. It was much the same back then. There were large areas of China where no foreigner was allowed. Peking itself, the imperial capital, didn't even allow embassies, because for them, they did not see the other powers as equal to themselves. They saw them as best barbarians, and worst barbarians, and at best tributary states, or states that should pay tribute in kind or in least respect. Up to that time, China had been the only power in that region. Every state surrounding it, except for Japan, was a tributary state. Now, the end of the war, the result was that Outer Manchuria was lost to Russia. Vladivostok was founded on what was up to then Chinese soil. So Vladivostok hasn't been Russian for very long. Parts of Mongolia were handed over to Russia, and parts of Central Asia, what later became known as Turkestan. Kowloon was also handed over to Britain in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong Island had been ceded during the First Opium War and Kowloon during the Second. Many more treaty ports were open, and freedom of religion was established in China. The reasons for the beginning of this war wasn't actually opium. It was the fact that foreigners had been detained, some of them killed. That's the reason France entered the war. Various trade posts had been hindered and captured, some of them even shelled. And so the foreign powers, seeing this, decided they needed to deal with this resistant power, you could say. At the time, China wasn't weak in many ways. It was a very powerful country, but it just didn't have the advanced weaponry of France and Britain. The United States was also partly involved in this. American naval ships and soldiers and marines cooperated with the French and the British against Chinese forces. The Russians, although not officially involved in the war, were obviously taking territories in the north. And at the end, the Americans pretended to be neutral, although they hadn't been. And even there was a British retreat from some forts near Tianjin. At one point in the war, the Americans had covered the British retreat by firing on the Chinese forts. One American commander saying, "Blood is thicker than water." So, it wasn't just the Brits. It was in many ways a coalition of various powers. At the end of the war, opium was made legal in China. So opium was a part of it. But most of that was because of the massive trade imbalance, China not allowing any imports from Western countries. So this led to a major drain in silver going from Western banks and businesses to Chinese coffers. When they said, initially, let's make things fair, China refused, kept on refusing, and so then that's when British started trading in opium. Try to get some of that silver back, balance the trade a bit. China banned it, not because the British were doing it, but because they weren't in charge of it. They weren't making money and they saw the money leaving. After that, that's when the first war broke out. The second war broke out because they refused to implement parts of the treaty from the first Opium War. And obviously they were attacking Westerners in China. And so it was a bit of a mess for China and resulted in a second massive defeat. At the end of the war, China was in a mess. They had to allow Western delegations or legations to be in what is now Beijing, Peking. That was a big deal for the Chinese. They did not want to recognize any of these countries as equal to them. Again, this is an ongoing thing in Chinese history, where they don't like having to recognize any other country as an equal. The war back home wasn't actually that popular in Parliament. A future Prime Minister, Gladstone, condemned it, and he's probably the one who popularised the name Opium War by calling it Palmerston's Opium War. Now, Palmerston was a very famous jingoistic politician who revelled in being Prime Minister, the leader of a very powerful country. He didn't like the criticism, and he didn't like the various votes in Parliament against this war. Gladstone saying it was a sin, and saying it would not be something that would reflect well upon England in the years ahead. Palmerston called an election and got a larger majority. So the people obviously thought he had been doing well. But at the end of the war, obviously Gladstone later on would become a part of a government after Palmerston fell, and later on become Prime Minister himself. But as Prime Minister, he wasn't exactly saintly when it came to imperialism either. So, the war dragged on for 4 years. Very long war, almost as long as the First World War. Didn't result in as many deaths, nowhere near. There were only a few thousand Western troops out there. And amongst Chinese, there were many more, but mostly troops in the tens of thousands, not like later on the Taiping Rebellion where tens of millions died. So this was called an unequal treaty. one of the unequal treaties, which is something that modern Chinese have talked about. But my understanding is most treaties are generally unequal. You could say that Versailles was unequal. You could say that Potsdam was very unequal. The victor will usually get the spoils. The loser loses. But this, again, is something in the Chinese psyche. They just do not accept the fact that they could ever lose to a foreigner, especially foreign barbarians. And so it has been used very effectively by the present Chinese regime, talking about the unequal treaties. And they talk about it a lot. They really don't let these things go. This would later on lead directly to the Boxer Rebellion. The sense of defeat, the resentment. They lost more wars to Russia, Japan, even Korea. It would lead eventually to the Boxer Rebellion, which pretty much destroyed the imperial system. So, on this day, October 18th, 1860, the Second Opium War ends very badly for China. Come back tomorrow for more.